So, welcome to the panel, How Was the American Revolution Revolutionary?, which is hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December of 2006, is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. Platypus organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, 1920s to 30s, new left, 1960s to 70s, and post-political left, 1980s to 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Here in New York City, we have active chapters at Columbia University, NYU, the New School, CUNY, Hunter College, and St. John's. I will introduce the panelists in order in which they will speak before reading the panel prompt. Our panelists will then have 10 minutes to present their opening remarks before allowing each to respond. We will then continue with our Q&A. Starting from the left, Professor James Oakes is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where he has taught since 1997. One of the leading historians of 19th century America, his work spans the history of the United States from the Revolution through the Civil War, with a particular focus on slavery as an economic and social system, anti-slavery politics, and emancipation. Among his books are The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, and Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, both of which were awarded the Gilder-Lehrman Prize. James Vaughn is Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the history of Britain and the British Empire in the 18th century, with a particular interest in the history of liberal democracy in the Age of Revolution. He is author of the book, The Politics of Empire at the Assertion of George III, and has also written about the American Revolution for the Platypus Review and the Journal of British Studies. Shaun KB is a member of the New York City District Council of Carpenters, a co-host of the podcast This Wreckage, and a founder of the Independent Labor Club of North America. The Independent Labor Club is a civil social organization Shaun founded on the idea that purely economic or syndicalist organization is insufficient and that the working class needs to be organized not merely at the point of production, but across all sites of social life. And last but not least, Professor Norman Markowitz, who is joining us today on Zoom, is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, where he has taught since 1971, focusing on 20th century US political history. He's the author of The Rise and Fall of the People's Century, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. He has written articles for the History News Network, the journal Political Affairs, and contributed entries to encyclopedias, including the Encyclopedia of American National Bibliography and the Encyclopedia of Social Movements. I will now read the panel prompt which we have posed to our panelists. Following the re-election of Lincoln as president, Marx wrote to the American people, "From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. In America, the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century. On the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Platypus invites the panelists to consider the following questions. How was the American Revolution revolutionary? Was there a left in the American Revolution? Should the left break with or build on the legacy of the American Revolution? What did historical socialism make of the American Revolution and its consequences? How should the left make sense of recent attempts to reject, reinterpret, or reclaim the revolutionary tradition of 1776? Does the American Revolution persist today? How does it inform the conditions of possibility for the left today? What tasks, if any, do the left inherit from the American Revolution? You may start.
Is this on? Okay. Thanks for having me. Thank you folks for coming. I'm not going to answer any of those questions. I'm going to talk about the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution for a few minutes and how the revolution set in motion a train of events that led ultimately to the destruction of slavery everywhere in the United States. The most familiar piece of that story is the abolition of slavery in the northern states beginning during the Revolution. I'll get to that later because that turns out to be a more complex and fascinating and even radical story than is usually made out to be. The simpler achievement of the Revolution in terms of the history of slavery was that the Revolution empowered the federal government to ban slavery from the Western territories. The Constitution allows Congress to do that. And without that, if you try to imagine American history from the Revolution to the Civil War without that power in Congress, all of American history would be changed. There would be no Missouri crisis. There would be no crisis over the annexation of Texas. The Mexican War would not have provoked northern anti-slavery congressmen to attempt to ban slavery from the Mexican cession. No Compromise of 1850, no Kansas, Nebraska, no Lecompton, no struggle, no decades of struggle over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories if the Revolution had not established the precedent that the federal government could do that and constitutionally empowered Congress to do that until 1857 when the Supreme Court said Congress rewrote the Constitution and said Congress didn't have that power. That's one thing, and so many people think of the Civil War as a struggle over the expansion of slavery, not slavery, and I think that's a serious mistake. And I want to explain for a few minutes why I think the abolition of slavery in the northern states had consequences that we don't always fully appreciate. The first thing it did was transform what had been a difference between the political economy of slavery in the southern colonies and the political economy of household production, which was the norm in the northern colonies. That socioeconomic or difference in political economy was present at the creation of the United States in 1776. But it was a sociological distinction, if you will. By abolishing slavery in the states, in the northern states, it transformed that difference in the political economy into a political distinction. And that had dramatic consequences, in particular for the second major issue that we don't always appreciate in the origins of the Civil War, and that is how you deal with fugitive slaves, right? In the 18th century, if a slave escaped from a slave state like Maryland into a state like Pennsylvania or New York where slavery was legal, the presumption in all of those states, the legal presumption was that black people were slaves, they were likely to be fugitives, and the fugitives were allowed to be carried back by their masters under a common law right of recapture. Once the northern states began to abolish slavery, the legal presumption was transformed, and the Somerset principle became the norm, which is to say that the presumption is that you're standing on free soil, you're presumptively free. And that makes every fugitive slave into a political problem in a way that it hadn't been the case. Right? So suddenly there's a fugitive slave issue, and you start seeing fugitive crises, not crises yet, but conflicts between northern states and southern states over fugitive slaves as early as the 1780s, right? But it's more radical than that in the sense that by abolishing slavery in the northern states, it set in motion the creation of a free black community that would number 250,000 by the eve of the Civil War. And by the 1830s, the black communities in the North were sufficiently well organized to begin to form vigilance committees that become the basis for what is known as the Underground Railroad. Right? And and the Underground Railroad becomes absolutely crucial, and black communities in the North become absolutely crucial to thwarting the attempts by Southern slaveholders to come into northern states and drag blacks off the streets on the grounds that they were slaves. And this creates the second major crisis between the North and the South that's going to lead to the secession of the Southern states in 1860. The northern states don't like returning fugitives to their owners. They pass a series of personal liberty laws that say they're anti-kidnapping laws to begin with, but the basic abolitionist position, and the position taken by all those who want to restrict slavery to the southern states and not allow southern slave law to be brought into northern states, is to guarantee the due process rights of anyone accused of being a fugitive slave. And that's why in the 1840s, when the black communities are particularly active in assisting fugitives to escape and make their way maybe to Canada, maybe New England, maybe upstate New York. By the 1840s, this is such an enormous problem that the Southerners start demanding a much more rigorous fugitive slave law. The notorious fugitive slave law of 1850 is famous for a lot of reasons, but it's most important for doing one specific thing. In 2 words, it says the federal commissioners who are now charged with enforcing this law shall do so without process. Right? That is, no due process, no jury trials, that's what they wanted. And that never went away. And by the time you get to the eve of the Civil War and the secessionists respond to the election of Abraham Lincoln, who has said repeatedly that he wants the fugitive slave law revised to allow for due process, that becomes the second major reason for the secession of 11 southern states. So the point is that the destruction of slavery is a process that begins with the American Revolution, is inspired by the American Revolution, and it's hard to imagine the ultimate destruction of slavery without the American Revolution, since the organizing framework, the basic underlying moral principle, if you will, is fundamental human equality. I don't think without fundamental human equality as a baseline principle, there is no abolitionism, there is no feminism, there's no socialism, and I think you see that in the way the outbreak of the American Revolution set this whole thing in motion.
Thank you. In some sense, you can view my remarks merely as prefatory to those. For those of you, 4 or 5 of you who've been around since 10 o'clock this morning, I apologize. I'm going to repeat some things I said on the first panel today. The American Revolution and the subsequent constitutional consolidation of the United States was the greatest political victory won by revolutionary liberalism, or, following Karl Marx, what I would term the revolutionary practical idealism of daily life in bourgeois society. That is, the society of universal free labor. Where did this society of universal free labor come from? I will not bore you, as I did on the first panel, with the origins of bourgeois or civil society, what the Germans call bürgerliche Gesellschaft. I will merely say that there was a world historical jailbreak at the westernmost part of the Eurasian landmass in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. And for a number of factors, there was a cumulative effect that had the unintended consequences of the first great world zone of free labor. Mm-hmm. That is, there was no longer unfree labor from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, from the Elbe River in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. And this universal society of free labor was one in which men and women increasingly set the course of their own existence, individually and collectively. It set in train the dialectic of labor and consciousness, most famously explained by Hegel in the phenomenology of right and later, in the phenomenology of spirit and later in the philosophy of right. That is, men and women, just in quotidian daily life, humble men and women had the capacity to set the course of their own existence, even if it meant that their life hadn't changed much, that they were still peasant farmers in basically a barely above subsistence agriculture. They could continue to figure out how to work harder and smarter, develop a surplus, spend it what they wanted to. But this world gave rise to an explosion of universal exchange of goods and services, of universal association and assembly and interaction, and increasingly free, self-possessed people in interacting with one another deepened their consciousness and their subjectivity. They became increasingly self-aware that they could be independent and self-determining, right? As Frederick Douglass would later describe it, people only learn how to be free in the course of being free. It's the school of life in a free society. That's how you become a free individual. Now, across the Western world, by the middle of the 18th century, roughly the era of the 7 Years' War, there was generalized discontent in this world of civil society, of bourgeois society, of the free relations of daily life with the old regime. And by the old regime, I do not simply mean the ancien regime of Bourbon France. I mean all the existing political orders of the Western world, whether it was the ossified commercial and financial oligarchy of the Dutch Republic, the ossified landed and commercial oligarchy of Great Britain, or the absolute monarchies of Bourbon France and Spain. There was generalized discontent. But this discontent went farther than anywhere else in the eastern seaboard colonies of British North America, from Georgia in the south to New Hampshire in the north. Why? Because there, beyond the slave plantations, the society of universal free labor had its greatest existence. It planted itself without any compromise with the past. Yes, free civil society had emerged in Western Europe, but in the backdrop of 1,000 years of Christian feudal medieval civilization with which it compromised. Yes, the Spanish Empire had taken some of the bourgeois commercial relations of free daily life across the Atlantic, but it compromised in the conquest of Aztecs Mexico and Incan Peru. In the free settler colonial population of British North America, bourgeois society came into its fullest, freest form by the middle of the 18th century. It was there, essentially, where people came to conclude that there was no need to have a political order that was justified on anything other than the basis of society itself. In other words, it was in the colonies, as Adam Smith explained in The Wealth of Nations, published 250 years ago in March 1776. It was in the free settler populations of colonial British North America that the understanding of revolutionary liberalism came into its own. At the core of this understanding was not an atomistic individualism in which there is no such thing as society, but rather that the most fundamental thing is society as such. That society is the fundamental basis of human existence, its ontological grounds. That the best form of society, if you'll forgive me, the most social society, is one based on free labor, in which the individual is subjectively independent, but objectively interdependent, dependent on others in the free relations of daily life. And that this form of social cooperation needs no justification outside of itself. That is to say that society can run of its own accord. It doesn't require the state, it doesn't require government or the law, it doesn't require a basis in divine right or bloodlines or hereditary status, or some pre-existing form of a social division of labor that determines people's lot at the beginning of their life, rather than them determining the course of their own lives over the course of life itself. And it was here by the mid-18th century that the civil society of the Western world was most discontented with the old regime. Essentially, sorry, apologies, I have to kind of edit as I go. By 1776, having been denied the historic rights of Englishmen, the colonial American resistance movement transformed itself into a revolutionary movement on the basis solely of this new understanding of civil society, of society itself. Before the Second Continental Congress explained the reasons that, quote, impelled them to the separation from Great Britain, they announced the transformation of the revolution of society into the revolution for society, making what remains the most important statement ever uttered by revolutionary liberalism. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, the Declaration of Independence was not merely declaring the independence of the United States from the British Empire, but it was declaring the independence of civil society, bourgeois society, from the world as it was, the world of hereditary status, of bloodline hierarchies, of caste, of arbitrary power and domination, of a world in which, as Jefferson said in 1826, some are born to rule and most are born to be ruled. He said this, Thomas Jefferson, 50 years later, upon the 50th anniversary of the celebration of the Declaration of Independence, when he was invited to DC to give an address, but because he basically lay dying at Monticello, he had to pen a statement which was subsequently read out loud. I would say basically that classical Marxism, and I'm referring to classical Marxism now because I take this question to be about what should the left make of the American Revolution and how revolutionary it was. For classical Marxists, there was nothing they would really add to Jefferson's understanding. For classical Marxists, there's really nothing they would add to Thomas Jefferson's understanding of the American Revolution. That is, Jefferson did not think it was simply about the revolution of the United States. He thought there was a world revolution fulfilling aspirations and demands the world over as bourgeois society, as civil society unfolded across the globe. And that what had happened in 1776, it had established a bridgehead in America. That essentially the revolution had come into America and claimed a country as its own. But that would merely be a bridgehead for a world revolution. As Jefferson said, it would come everywhere. In some places sooner, other places later, but eventually everywhere. And I think the only disagreement classical Marxism would have with this statement is that it came to most places of the world in contradiction and crisis because of the development of what Marx called the advanced capitalist mode of production, that is industrial capitalism, in the 19th century, when society was proletarianized and industrialized and came into contradiction and crisis with itself. However, this classical Marxist understanding on the left has been, if you forgive this play on words, progressively supplanted by a progressive interpretation. That progressive interpretation arose in the late 19th and early 20th century. Its most famous expositors were Charles Beard and Karl Becker, and they self-consciously thought of themselves as anti-socialist and anti-revolutionary. Progressives always viewed themselves as anti-socialist, not as socialists, and they articulated a narrative of the constitutional order that consolidated the United States as a counter-revolutionary attempt to undo or to limit the revolution. That is a narrative which with classical socialists and Marxists disagreed, but over the course of the 20th century, as revolutionary socialism and Marxism receded into the background, this progressive interpretation became dominant on the left, and it became the justification for a new form of state power that removes itself from society. Remember, at the heart of the American Revolution is the idea that there can be nothing outside of society. There can be no state outside of society. There is no absolute sovereign power outside of society. All power in society is accountable to society itself. And the progressives use this counter-revolutionary interpretation of the American Revolution to raise up a state power outside of society. Woodrow Wilson called it the fourth branch of government. Other progressives gave it different names, but it was essentially meant to be the transcendence of the constitutional order without admitting that the constitutional order had been transcended. And what I would say is that the socialist and Marxist left thought that of course there was a crisis in the United States, but that was the crisis of capitalist society. And then industrial capitalism had to be confronted and overcome. And they deeply disagreed with the progressives, who instead decided to claim that society was not capable of governing itself. And rather than a social revolution overthrowing capitalism, they sought to erect a new branch of government, a state power independent of society itself, by which they could give the law but not receive the law. Apologies if I went over time.
I guess I'm up now. Whoever set this panel up did a really great job, because I feel very comfortable following that up. I'll read from this. I released this essay last year as a way to think about this world historic moment of transition we appear to be living in. Of the many, which is to say 3 essays that I've published, this one got the most negative comments. Some accused me of being enthralled to some fantastical entity called the last Marxist. Others were upset that I seemed to call the New Deal reactionary. Still others wondered how, if I did a whole podcast series reading J. Sakai's Settlers, I could write it all positively about the results of America's bourgeois revolution. To paraphrase our 40th president, it is not because I have read Settlers that I can reject the MLM thesis. It is because I have read and understood J. Sakai that I can reject it. The genesis for this essay was actually not from necessarily any of these things. It was simply listening attentively and discussing with many of the people that I work with day in and day out as a tradesperson, as they themselves have tried to understand this world that we live in. I think it'll become clear through the course of this essay how the working class bears some sort of tradition of this American Revolution with it as it moves through history. Thank you for explaining what the ILC is. Folks should know that this essay was written as a polemic, not an internal one, but an external one, but also with the help of the Independent Labor Club to kind of clarify what it is that we're doing. So I've done some light editing to this October 2025 essay to put it in good form for today. It's called Gadsden's Over Rio. Something global is happening. Make America Great Again flags fly over evangelical churches in Central America. Gadsden flags, with their famous quote, "Don't tread on me," wave over Rio de Janeiro. A sign amidst a raucous protest outside Australian Parliament reads, "Overgoverned, overtaxed, overrun. We need a fix like 1776. Pretty late in the day, sorry. Thank you. Pretty late in the day for a Commonwealth country like Australia with a Windsor at its head of state, if you ask me. At first glance, there is something absurd and postmodern about this play of signifiers across diverse geographies by various populations fighting for what seems like very different things. But surely hundreds of millions of people all over the globe mean something when they fly these flags or engage with political movements that do. What would it look like to take these ostensibly ridiculous political expressions seriously, to interrogate what they might actually mean at this particular and peculiar historical juncture? The fact is that what many have called the neoliberal system that we have grown up with, and took as something akin to a force of nature, is in deep crisis. The material underpinnings for United States hegemony are under threat across the globe. There is a tendency on the left and right to see this primarily as a geopolitical event, the rise of a multipolar world. The broad left hopes that this shift might bring some needed counterbalance to the overweening power of U.S. finance capital, but cannot look beyond a perpetual order of large, medium, and small nation states jockeying for power and influence in a global capitalist system. I would argue that the issues at work and the consequences of this crisis are far greater than a shift in foreign policy or the locus of international power. What is crumbling at this historical juncture is an entire imperial system abroad, and especially at home in the United States. What is under threat by popular forces and the contradictions of this mode of production is that Bonapartist imperial state that grew like a carbuncle on the American Republic, beginning in the 19th century, and in the 20th century advanced an apparatus of tyranny whose legacy we live with in the 21st century. The American Republic was overthrown because the threat of proletarian socialism necessitated it. Wearing the badge of progressivism and the skin suit of organized labor, The empire smothered the independent workers' movement with a modern administrative state. Federal policies were put in place to serve as counter-tendencies to the concentration and combination of capital, while the concentration and combination of legally sanctioned workers' organizations led to the working class's subordination under the Democratic Party. In the 20th century, the reactionary middle classes, facing their ruin, erected an entire edifice, an undemocratic administrative state housed within the executive branch and populated by hand-picked experts, to stand athwart history yelling "stop," and to ensure that small property, whether in the guise of small business or the petty property of educational credentials, could reproduce itself. This Bonapartist state, created at home to deal with the upsurge of working-class self-activity in the Great Depression, was then unleashed abroad under the rubric of the Cold War. Here it gained legitimacy at home while colonizing much of what would become the collective West. After 1991, the administrative state morphed into an entire ersatz civil society of non-governmental organizations tied to one or both of the capitalist political parties in the United States and their cadet branches in Europe. In the context of a historically specific imperial project, increasingly at crisis with itself, we need a fix like 1776 in a Commonwealth country like Australia maybe isn't so absurd after all. It is no surprise that these ancient mandals are being born abroad, as the U.S. War for Independence was the most substantive bourgeois revolution in history with a long and checkered afterlife. What we are seeing, and what we ignore at our peril, is that there is a growing international Republican movement afoot, something akin to a global 1848. This Republican movement sets itself against what the populists call globalism. They call for people power against the Davos elite. They see demonic forces at work undermining Christian civilization. They want to take back sovereignty of nations and control of borders. All of which is to say that currently the global Republican movement has only a right wing. This may confuse middle-class intellectuals steeped in the ideology of conservative or bourgeois socialism. But if anyone still believes in small R Republican ideals like non-domination by the state or private actors, civil liberties, and substantive independence, it's the working classes of the capitalist core. By contrast, what passes for the American left has long since acquiesced to the death of the Republic, and in doing so, buried Marxism's undeniable social Republican roots. 3 minutes? 2 minutes. Building a left wing of winning back the Republic is not about appealing to MAGA workers by tailing the reactionary right. It is about building an explicitly proletarian wing of the already existing global Republican movement. Regardless if Trump 2.0 is any indication, the political program of the right-wing middle class is dead in the water. It's just not possible at this late date to raise small property up to prominence again, not least because the center of global value production no longer resides in the middle-class conservative socialist West, but increasingly in the capitalist states of East Asia. Against the anti-globalists, xenophobic, Christian fundamentalist, nationalist, petty bourgeois right-wing republicanism of MAGA and its confederates across the globe, we must counterpose a solidaristic, secular, internationalist, working-class republicanism. The latter has deep roots in North America going back to abolitionism and working-class movements like the Knights of Labor in the 19th century. The Independent Labor Club is not the political expression of left-wing republicanism itself, but the potential connective tissue of a broader working-class movement for class independence on Republican terms that must necessarily cohere itself in civil society before it can take on an independent form. And I have more, but apparently I'm out of time, so thank you.
Okay, Professor Markowitz, you can...
Okay. Okay. Norman, do I go next now? Can you hear me?
We can hear
I've
you
had
now,
trouble
yes.
hearing the people here. Okay.
We can hear you, yes. You can go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
Can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Should I begin, Norman?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay. I've had a lot of trouble hearing the presentations, which is of course bad. I heard parts of them, and I have some disagreements with my fellow Marxists. So let me begin. Let me begin right now. I also have major agreements, and I'm very happy to participate. Very happy. I spoke 6 years ago at Columbia when the discussions were focused on the 1619 Project and the left. That was near the end of the first Trump administration, and there was little discussion about it, except to call it reactionary, corrupt, and incompetent. Today, the second Trump administration is literally seeking to dismantle American history and erase from it all non-white, non-Christian, non-national chauvinist movements and struggles. And in the tradition of Hitler fascism, to make Trump himself the fulfillment of that history. History is always about the present, interpreting the past in order to both understand it and use it to understand the present and the forces creating the likely future. Documents, particularly the primary ones, are of course very important, but the framework in which we present those documents into a narrative is far more important. Although many historians do not even think that they have a framework, my framework is the struggle between social classes over the means and forces of production within a society. The raw materials, machinery, and labor through which production is carried out. The political and social system will rest on that economic foundation and change as it changes. In short, I interpret history from a Marxist perspective. I don't use terms like classical Marxism or neo-Marxism. I am a Marxist-Leninist committed to revolutionary socialism and the communist movement, and have been for nearly 50 years now. What is a revolution? It is a long historical process, economic, political, and social, not simply winning a few battles, ousting a government, and establishing a new one. The American Revolution, a bourgeois revolution, the term used for capitalist, took place when the capitalist system and the capitalist class was young. The English Puritan Revolution, the first major bourgeois revolution, took place more than a century before the American Revolution, and it followed perhaps 2 centuries in which the merchant class of the towns had been growing in importance, fighting against aristocratic landlords, feudal ruling class, and their economy based on production for their use, with peasants working for them and artisans providing them with luxury goods. The English Revolution of the 1640s resulted in the establishment of a revolutionary army, the New Metal Army, led by the merchant and capitalist gentry classes, defeating the aristocrats and their armies, executing the king, putting down a radical democratic movement called the Levelers, and also the first, historians contend, communist movement in history, the religious-based Digger movement and its leader, Gerard Winstanley. establishing a bourgeois or capitalist dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. This was a revolutionary dictatorship which collapsed after Cromwell's death. The monarchy was restored, but it was never to be the absolutist divine right monarchy again. The language of the revolution itself, the mobilizing language in the 1640s, had been religious. Now, as Karl Marx would later write, it became political, as the bourgeois revolutionary John Locke, who would influence significantly American Enlightenment thinking in the 18th century, wrote about representative government and rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property. When the House of Commons ousted the last autocratic king, James II, and established its supremacy over the monarchy, the British Revolution, with its limitations, had been completed. But there were echoes of that revolution throughout North America, where the Puritan Revolution lived on in a variety of ways, by powerful merchants and gentry investing in colonial settlements, and by royal colonies. While the monarchy and the aristocracy had been restored in Britain, there was in the North American colonies the symbol of the crown, but not a king in power. And there were various assemblies and councils, not chosen by the people, but chosen by property owners. And there were three major classes: merchant capitalists, wealthy landowners, and, by the 18th century, slaveholders, among a population of small farmers, skilled, self-employed artisans called mechanics, and large numbers of contract agricultural laborers called indentured servants, and by the 18th century, increasing numbers of slaves from Africa along with the native population. The North American colonies found themselves under the control, by the end of the 17th century, of the Board of Trade. The empire's policies toward the colonies was, like all empires, to keep them capital poor. But this was the capitalism of commercial or merchant capitalism, to make them produce and sell raw materials at low prices, and produce finished goods and purchase finished goods from the empire at high prices. The argument made by the Board of Trade was that this would produce wealth for metropolitan Britain that would benefit everyone, that would trickle down. The colonies had no representation in Parliament, no taxation without representation had been an ideal of the English Revolution, but the empire asserted the policy of virtual representation. In the first half of the 18th century, the northern American colonies found themselves as future colonies and neo-colonies would, for centuries on and today, be used as pawns in a series of wars between the two great empires of the world at the time, the British and French empires. These wars were fought in Europe, on the sea, in India, and North America. The colonies got nothing of any value from them. Meanwhile, the colonies themselves began to produce a more and more interconnected merchant, gentry, and slaveholder classes that sought freedom for themselves. And freedom meant the freedom to produce and sell whatever goods they wanted in a developing world market, to expand territory as they saw fit, not as the empire saw fit. These classes also feared the popular masses, the poor farmers and urban laborers, and of course the slaves and the indigenous people called Indians, who might rise and seize a revolutionary process. Now, there were privileged elements among these classes, empire loyalists they were called, who benefited from imperial subsidies and special grants. The events of the 1750s and 1760s would set the stage for a revolutionary crisis and a great bourgeois revolution, a second bourgeois revolution, that would create the first major bourgeois republic in history. To boil this down as much as I can, the British Empire defeated the French Empire in the 7 Years' War and gained control of all of North America, and also eliminated the French threat to its position in India. A conservative government called Tory, that's still the term used for conservatives in Britain, under the leadership of George Grenville, raised taxes very sharply on the colonies to pay for the overhead of this greatly expanded empire. It also began to enforce restrictions on the colonial elites who could accumulate wealth through trade, which had previously been lax. The conservative government restricted westward settlement by investment companies in the colonies in order to prevent new Indian wars, which might be used to restore the French. Fearful also, primarily, of the growing power of the merchant capitalist class, whose great strength was centered in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston, the Tory government instituted a crippling tax on all commercial documents, the Stamp Act. Here, the merchant capitalist class led massive resistance to this, formed groups called the Sons of Liberty, made violent attacks on empire officials, destroyed empire tax offices, and forced the repeal of the Stamp Act. But this was only the beginning. Other taxes followed, producing widespread resistance and the establishment of committees of correspondence to coordinate opposition, resistance among the colonies. Boston became, because it was the center of the merchant capitalist class, the most powerful center, the most important center of this developing revolution. The Boston Massacre of 1770, the subsequent tea tax for the benefit of the East India Company, which in many ways was the first great corporation in history. It controlled all of India, like corporations today was run by speculators and swindlers, whose policies had brought it to the brink of bankruptcy many times. It then sought to dump the tea here in the North American colonies.
Professor Markowitz, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I will just ask you to wrap up your opening remarks, please.
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I will just ask you to please wrap up your opening remarks, please.
Say that again. You want me to sum up? I don't know.
Yes, please. Wrap up. Finish your opening remarks.
How much time do I have?
Technically none.
Okay. That's bad. So let me try to finish up. The American Revolution would break out. The Declaration of Independence, influenced strongly by Tom Paine, himself a revolutionary in the fullest sense, would eventually result in the establishment of the American Republic. But what kind of republic was it? Feudal vestiges were eliminated, but another revolution, the Industrial Revolution, was in the process of taking place, and that revolution would be centered in Britain, which would have a virtual monopoly on that revolution until the middle of the 19th century. Quickly, the American Revolution would result in a constitution that was necessary to defend the revolution, but in effect strengthened the power of the slaveholder class, who, by writing slavery into the Constitution, the American Revolution achieved a tremendous lucky break. The French Revolution began. And this took the heat off the American Revolution. George Washington, the first president, would then bar blacks of any kind from serving in the military. The policy, the struggles of the 1790s between Federalists representing merchant capital who supported a strong national government, and the anti-Federalists resulted eventually in the victory of Jefferson. Jefferson, figure of the Enlightenment, who believed in the possibility of the free development of all people except slaves. Jefferson's concept of an empire for liberty then became central to this developing revolution. The American Revolution continued really until 1820, until the Second Anglo-American War, and the formation of a kind of détente between the British Empire, which used the American Empire, the American Republic, for its own purposes against its enemies in Europe, and the American Republic. Out of that war, Andrew Jackson, slaveholder, Indian killer, emerged as a national hero. Jackson would establish in popular thought the concept of democracy. What did he mean by democracy? Two
Professor,
things.
I will
We are
ask
the
you
party
to...
of the common man, and we are the party of the white man's country. Eventually, abolitionists who functioned the way Marxists would see communists as a revolutionary vanguard would mobilize forces and set the stage for a broad anti-slavery coalition and the end of slavery in the Civil War.
Thank you.
I would
Sorry.
finally make these 2 quick
Professor-
points
Professor
and leave
Markowitz.
it at that. Okay, you got me here.
Sorry,
Okay.
sorry about that, but thank you
Okay.
very much.
We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Marx.
Sorry,
saw the
can we
American
just can we make
Revolution.
sure that
Okay. If you want me to stop, I will. My last point only was that color racism. Marx was wrong. He believed that the American Revolution would lead to a socialist development of socialism faster than in Europe because of the absence of a feudal aristocracy. Over and over again, color racism has deformed the history of the United States, and it is still essential in understanding what happened with the rise of Donald Trump, who is literally trying to institutionalize the very worst of all of American history. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And sorry to go on and on.
No worries.
I'm wordy and have a strange computer.
Can we
Okay.
just make sure that Professor Markowitz can understand us all right? Can you hear me when I'm speaking right now, Professor?
Okay.
Can you hear me when I'm speaking like this?
Okay. Still having trouble hearing people, but I'll do my best.
Yeah. Okay. It would just be good if he could hear what the other panelists will respond. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me, Professor, when I'm speaking like this? Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me, Professor? Is that better? Hello? Test, test. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hello? Can you hear me when I speak like this?
Yeah,
Yes?
I can hear you better now.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, then we can continue. Yeah, each of you will have some time now to respond to the other panelists' opening remarks, or use that freely. Shaun, if you want to finish your piece, you're free to do so, and maybe try to keep it under 5 minutes. Thank you.
I'm so good. I'm getting more time. That's
Sorry,
pretty
Shaun.
good.
Can we start with Professor?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Please,
No,
Professor Oakes, you're so good. You're getting more time.
Sorry, no, I worded it weirdly. Sorry.
Is it? Okay, there we go. I don't have much to add. I want to build on something that James said about the significance of the American Revolution. I think it's interesting that the mass street demonstrations against Donald Trump were called No Kings rallies, because they're tying themselves back to the American Revolution. Whatever you think of the efficacy of those kinds of demonstrations, but it is very important. It is more important than we sometimes realize that the American Revolution repudiated monarchy, repudiated titled nobilities, repudiated the traditional hierarchies that are based on birth and status. And the result of that was when the ruling class that begins to emerge in the aftermath of the American Revolution is going to be based on, first on wealth, ultimately, and ultimately on the control of proletarianized labor. So it's a kind of, by eliminating those traditional ancient forms of social hierarchy, it leads to a completely different form that we're much more familiar with today. I also think that I didn't say that underlying the transition that I described earlier from the Revolution to the Civil War is the superior economic performance of the North, ultimately, that ultimately is crucial to understanding how the North can ultimately defeat the South when it comes to a struggle over slavery. So that the kind of capitalist formation that is emerging in the North far outstrips the wealth, and it's quite significant wealth, of the slaveholding class in the southern states. So it's the unleashing of those forces of capitalist development, ultimately with the industrialization of the North, the early industrialization of the North, that explains the shift in the power dynamics underlying all those struggles over slavery that I talked about earlier.
I would just build on that with some further 18th century background. That is, if you're looking at the British colonies of North America around 1700, there's no question that the slave plantations are incredibly dynamic centers of development, production, etc. The colonies are they're less than 200,000 people at that time. They hug the eastern seaboard. They're filled with religious zealotry and frontier wars, but there's a remarkable development over the next 6 decades amongst the free settler population, the free labor population, which leads to the greatest growth in per capita income in human history before the Industrial Revolution, the greatest demographic expansion in human history before the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, the free settler population goes from just under 200,000 to just over 2 million in the matter of 5 decades, 6 decades. There had never been anything like that in recorded history prior to the Industrial Revolution, and it's not being driven solely by immigration, it's native-born births as well. And so by the time of the American Revolution, you have to remember that the most dynamic, prosperous, developing areas of the colonies are the free labor areas, where free social and economic cooperation has taken place the farthest. And it is not yet the world, as Jim said, of the Industrial Revolution and the cotton gin, which is going to create cotton kingdom and industrialize slavery. We're in a world in the 1760s and 1770s where people have come to realize the productive power, prosperity, and dynamism of free labor. And everything they're doing is designed to increase free labor. In every colonial, not every, but in 10 out of 13 colonial assemblies, there are bills to attempt to limit any further development of slavery prior to the American Revolution, largely because they don't want a plantation monoculture, which they think develops oligarchic inequalities, etc. The British Empire ultimately vetoes those bills because the slave trade is fundamental to the triangular trade and British imperial trade. Furthermore, when the revolution breaks out and those town and county meetings take place and people say our rights can no longer be based on the traditional rights of Englishmen, and they go out into the void and they say our rights are based simply on natural rights, the rights of mankind. Society has no justification, needs no justification beyond itself. In those town and county meetings, it's hard for us to imagine. There are, particularly in the North, enslaved people that come, that are in domestic servitude and are participating in those discussions and are saying that that this means also our rights as well. You begin to get in 74, 75, at the birth of the revolutionary crisis, petitions being put forward by free whites, free blacks, and enslaved blacks that basically say the rights that are being demanded mean that slavery has to be put on the chopping block. And I want to correct something Matt McManus said earlier. I'm sorry if he's not here. I would do this if he was here or not. He invoked this correspondence between Abigail Adams and John Adams in the lead up to the Declaration of Independence, where he said that, John Adams cynically dismisses all of this talk. John Adams says in this correspondence famously, everybody is blaming us revolutionaries on overthrowing the world. They don't think we're just aiming at independence from Britain. They think that we're aiming at the end of slavery and the end of oligarchy and the end of autocracy and the end of everything. And Adams later comes to say that he understood that that was what they were aiming at. That is to say, in the unfolding of the revolution itself, people come to realize there are slumbering in humanity possibilities and potentials that went unrealized. But the only reason why they could go to Abigail Adams arguing for greater liberation and emancipation for women, for enslaved people arguing for the end of slavery, for people talking about lowering the property qualification, all of that was precisely the achievements of the American Revolution. And just to conclude, to reiterate what Jim said, because I think it really is important here, okay? The first great act of the expansion of the United States is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which says that there will not be one extension of an enslaved person into the Northwest Territory, today's upper Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, etc. Okay? And furthermore, at the Constitutional Convention, they do not, I'm sorry, Norman, they do not say slavery anywhere in the document. And in fact, there was a battle at the Constitutional Convention. There were people from the North who did want to move against slavery, but there was a view of that might split the Union into civil war. But the idea was not that they were preserving slavery, but they were setting it up to a very slow road to extinction. You would allow the abolition of the slave trade in 1808. You would continue to accumulate Western territories that were free labor states. And eventually the dynamism of free labor, of free social and economic cooperation, of the universal commodity form of labor, of the exchange of labor and its products by free people, that would overtake slavery and lead to the gradual, peaceable end of slavery in the southeastern United States where it existed. But as Chris said in the previous panel, or maybe the panel before that, things are a blur now, right? They didn't see Eli Whitney's cotton gin coming in 1793. They didn't see the insatiable demand for raw cotton that the mills of Lancashire and Britain, that Manchester, Birmingham would demand. And suddenly the cotton kingdom came and slavery kept roaring back. And indeed, it was people initially blushed when they defended slavery. They did not think, they in fact thought that the American Revolution was setting slavery on the road to extinction. And it's only with John C. Calhoun and this kind of new ideology of slavery that develops in the 1820s and 30s that you get this idea that's a positive institution that doesn't need to defend itself anymore. And indeed, it's those slaveholders from Calhoun to Alexander Hamilton Stevens? Alexander Stevens and Jefferson Davis that will say they are overthrowing the principles of the American Revolution. Never forget the cornerstone or the foundation stone speech by Alexander Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, where they said Jefferson was a fool. He was an Enlightenment fool who believed in the equality of all people. And he didn't think that Jefferson excluded slaves. Not for a second did he think that. Rather, Alexander Stevens said, we new men of science, we have 19th century science, and we know that there are some born to be ruled and others born to be ruled, except they understood it in racial, biological terms. White people are born to rule, non-white people, etc., are born to be ruled. And they understood themselves as having to overthrow that American Revolution Jeffersonian commitment. They thought they were doing that. Sorry, to go on, but I just want to clarify that.
Yeah. Let me disagree with that very strongly, if I can.
Check.
Let me disagree with those comments in a friendly way, but very strongly. First, the Three-Fifths Compromise, in effect, legitimized slavery within the American Constitution. Secondly, your comments about the Northwest Ordinance are true. But by the end of the 1790s, everything had changed. Everything had changed. Jefferson's Empire for Liberty clearly was not anti-slavery. And as Marx would contend, the great wealth of commercial and early industrial capitalism was based very heavily on slave labor. We should remember that the first, until the end of the Civil War, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Polk, were slaveholders. We should remember that the power and influence of the slaveholder class grew, and slavery itself became much more central to this economy. We should also remember that the American Revolution had no economic foundation to advance the principles that you're talking about and advocate. Good principles. We should remember that Jefferson's party, while it expanded voting rights for the white common man, took those rights away from free blacks. Free blacks supported the Federalists, and there the documentation is clear and massive. We should also remember that the Civil War and the defeat of the Confederacy ultimately, as W.E.B. Du Bois would argue, the economic foundation that the revolutionary abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens fought for, and that many others fought for, black and white, revolutionary land reform, redistributing the millions of acres of the large plantations to the former slaves and to poor whites, was never enacted. And without that economic foundation, what followed was the restoration of a system of brutal, repressive color racism, essentially a racist dictatorship. We should also remember that right after World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, a progressive, a liberal, a social democratic liberal, came forward with a post-war policy, an economic Bill of Rights policy, in which the advances of the 1930s in which the Communist Party had played a central role. Unemployment insurance, Social Security, the rights of workers to form unions, minimum wages, and also the battle against racism, which Roosevelt did not identify with, frankly, which was one of Tess's most important weaknesses. Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, the establishment of national public health insurance, the establishment of national public transportation, national public education with free tuition higher education, a program, and a national full employment act. All of these acts were, in effect, not carried forward, not advanced, thanks to the development of the Cold War, because the capitalist class, at the end of World War II, had unprecedented wealth and power in a revolutionary world where they could get it all, they believed, or lose it all. And this has happened over and over again. And of course, it happened with the defeat of the Great Society in the 1970s. And after that, there isn't anything. There really isn't anything. We have been under the leadership of the right and center right really for the last 58 years, leading eventually to Trump. Okay, the American Revolution in a positive way, is something that we can carry forward by carrying forward Tom Paine, not Thomas Jefferson, by carrying forward Benjamin Rush, by carrying forward Thaddeus Stevens, the abolitionist leaders, and after the Civil War, carrying forward Eugene V. Debs, later William Z. Foster, those who carried forward the struggle. And not only socialists and communists, but people like Ralph Nader. I disagree with the comment about progressivism also. I could go into that in detail. It took broad, united and people's fronts, involving liberals, involving progressives, to bring about the changes, the positive changes that were necessary. And it still does. The failure to do that, to develop that, has put us in the position where we are today. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Those are my responses.
Thank you.
Right.
Sean, do you want to give your responses, and then we go over to Q&A?
Yeah. My response is that I feel like my imposter syndrome being up here with 3 professors is like at 100% right now. So I don't know.
Okay.
I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I feel like there's a way that we can think about this history, because we have a lot of historians here differently that might be useful for us. One way that I found it useful over the last few months, since there's been let's call it a right-wing freakout about Zoran's mayoralty bringing back the bad old days of the 1970s and 1980s, is to take our focus from instead like political decisions that were taken by the Lindsay or the Beam administration in the 60s and 70s, and instead looking at like the urban crisis, the loss of 1 million jobs from this city. And why is it that this trauma still animates a lot of the local politics here in New York City without actually addressing what it was that caused the bad old days of the 70s and 80s to arise? In a very similar way, like when we talk about, as the professor discusses, this right-wing pushback of the 70s and 80s, this like political decision to create neoliberalism as the narrative is given to us, I think it's very useful to look at the history and say, like, if we imagine it a different way, which is if you look at the wildcat strikes in auto plants in the 1970s, if you look at the way in which the young proletariat after 68 rejected factory labor and the Treaty of Detroit and the speed-ups and automation or whatever, if you understand that the working class of the 1930s created, in a sense, through its self-activity, a New Deal order which ends up being ossified, right, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the working class too destroyed that order in the 1960s and 70s, either by failing to stand up for it when it was under attack by there is no alternative, or by literally a wildcat strike wave, which was the largest wave of strikes that we've seen since then, in the last 50 years or so. And that brings working class agency back into the equation, right? That brings us away from the realm of like partisan politics and ideology and back into the realm of political economy and back into the realm of classes, right? And with that said, I think that there's like a way in which our emphasis is constantly trying to like get away from very central, I think, important concerns that previous generations of Marxists have had in what is the legacy of the bourgeois revolution. And with that, you invited me to speak and finish my piece. So I will read maybe 2 more paragraphs, if I have time to read 2 paragraphs. Okay. We don't choose politics, ladies and gentlemen. Politics chooses us. In the era of Clinton and Obama, the left was trying to work within progressivism to give it a working class basis. In the era of Trump, we must work within the ongoing battle against the Bonapartist state to make the Republican paper is so complicated, isn't it? The Republican movement socialist again for the first time, to posit the working classes of the planet as heirs to a revolutionary legacy around which all capitalist politics still rotates. Our allegiance isn't to a flag or to the country for which it stands, but to the historical process of political freedom, inaugurated by the rise of bourgeois civil society and the abolition of feudal social relations, and recognized by Marx and Engels as the precondition for working class self-activity. The petty bourgeois can be easily organized for their reactionary vision of the Republic because production already organizes them, and the ideology of Americanism holds them up as the wellspring of social freedom. It's not so easy for us, but the common sense small r republicanism of the working class is a premise already in existence, however much it is an ideal to which those who claim to be socialists will have to adjust themselves. And this is my main point of this whole essay, which I hope I haven't bored you all with by droning on. I can't speak extemporaneously like the professors can, which is that folks have to understand that out there in this big wide world outside of political conferences, historical conferences, or whatever, which are important in their own right, there is a deep sense that things are very wrong. And there is a common sense that the way that these things should be attacked is by like big R Republican senses of like personal responsibility, meritocracy, or whatever, right? But the wellspring of all of that, and I think that what we should pay attention to as socialists, because I am one, I'm a socialist, as I think many of you are here, is that within that kernel, in that shell, right, or that metaphysical shell of like petty bourgeois republicanism or whatever, exists something of 1776 that we as socialists can grasp onto, because it is like an anti-domination, it is a free association, it is a concern with civil rights, it is a concern with individual and collective rights, right? That ultimately within what could be called the reactionary building trades, which I'm in right now, is the dominant idea, right, of like how one lives a good life. And maybe that is a better starting point than like progressivist, statist, like Democratic Party politics of corporatism. if we're honest with ourselves, like the part of Donald Trump's MAGA movement that might be the most fascist is the part that is what he is, which is a Ed Koch Democrat from the 1970s and 1980s. Kicking Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene out of the MAGA movement was a signal moment, one that was really important. I wish my friend, what's his name, Gerald, what was the gentleman that was on the last panel? Yes, thank you. My Italian-American friend there, he might agree with me because I'm a big Judge Knapp watcher. I wouldn't say a fan, but, I watch him all the time. It's that, like, there is something in there, in this history that the professors have been so good at enumerating that really has purchase within what's left of the industrial working class in this country. And we ignore it to our peril. And when we see these international global movements against tyranny, we need a fix like 1776 in Australia, that's what we should be focusing our attention on, not this sort of like true socialism, like Christian socialism of 1847 that Marx critiqued, because we're in an 1848 moment, we're not in a 1917 moment. And I think that ultimately is what we should, I would like to leave things with, is that we need to start at the basics and the brass tacks, and 1776 is a good place to begin that.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to questions.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of some of the things that Shaun just said and maybe bring it back to your first presentation, James, when you had mentioned that earlier in the American colonial resistance movement that they were perhaps motivated by small c conservative concerns before they made the great leap, or however you put it. And you also said that, sorry, just going to adjust this, that in the 19th century that there was an ossification of classical liberalism on the one hand and classical socialism on the other. And I was wondering maybe if you could speak to how you think about the character of this like lowercase c conservatism changing before and after that ossification happens. Because a lot of what Norman was bringing up was maybe a concern of the significant overburdening of the American Revolution with conservatism. But then on the other hand, some of Shaun's comments and also Kelly's comments bring to mind maybe this idea of preserving 1776 and getting back to the original liberal thought after progressivism goes off the rails, or winning back the republic. So these different ideas of conservatism and that original distinction you had made between the ossification of liberalism in this earlier moment.
Thank you. I'll just try and do that briefly. Can everybody hear me? To the second part, the ossification of liberalism, all that I had meant was, that the first panel was about, was the American Revolution liberal? And I was trying to defend that it was liberal, but kind of answer the second question, what does liberalism mean? And I regard liberalism originally to have been essentially radical bourgeois thought, but which essentially came to culmination in the age of revolution of the later 18th and early 19th century, and was famously referred to after the French Revolution as the left. But when you get the full development of what Marx called the capitalist mode of production, what I'll simply call industrial capitalism, when you get the proletarianization of society, not only do you have a conflict arise between capital and labor, but you have an ideological fracturing of the left into this one tradition, classical liberalism, and this other tradition, classical socialism. And all I was trying to say is that 19th century liberalism and 19th century socialism are both heirs to the left, to the tradition of bourgeois radicalism that emerges in the age of revolution, or what R.R. Palmer called the age of democratic revolution. And we could see that the rise of liberalism and socialism were themselves indicative of a crisis of society. And I think what the classical liberalism of the 19th century is an ossified liberalism. It's no longer revolutionary critique, it's basically ideology, right? Essentially in the classical Marxist sense. And to go back to your first part of your question, what did I mean about the initial conservatism of the colonial American resistance movement? Well, at the end of the 7 Years' War, when the new British imperial policies began to be put into place, when they overthrow the system of salutary neglect and they begin enforcing laws of trade navigation they haven't enforced in decades, when they pass the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and they do the proclamation line, which says there can't be any settlement west of the Appalachians, all of those policies basically trigger the rise of a colonial American resistance movement that is initially small c conservative. That is, they want the status quo antebellum before the 7 Years' War. And they understand their society, which is a uniquely participatory society and emancipated society. They understand their society to be rooted ultimately in the historic customary rights of Englishmen. So they're also small c conservative in the sense that they understand themselves not just to be defending practices status quo antebellum, but also they're defending the historic customary rights of Englishmen. They basically become disabused of that notion over the imperial crisis. They come to be told largely by British ministers and officials that this link between taxation and representation doesn't really exist. We tax people all the time without representing them in Britain. In fact, that's most of the Western world. You have some wild notion that the state can't enter into your labor and take it without your permission. That's a crazy notion. Those aren't the rights of Englishmen. Furthermore, the rights of Englishmen don't cross the Atlantic. They're territorially, jurisdictionally bounded. All of that. And it's only in the process of that collective learning process in all these town and county meetings taking place in rural Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, and rural Georgia and Savannah, so on and so forth, that they come to explain to themselves that the only basis of their rights is really their society itself, their society of free labor itself. And that's what I meant about how the small c conservatism eventually becomes a radicalism. But there is a hesitancy about staking claims that are completely novel. That is to say that they can take up arms and that they can tear down one form of government, institute another, is like Columbus crossing the Atlantic in 1492. They're alighting upon an undiscovered country. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what all the potentialities of it are, right? But I always find it historically anachronistic and absurd to imagine that one can then take, 2026 and say they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. And I think the most important question is, would you rather Jefferson had said those things or he didn't say those things, right? What would you have rathered? And that question, to ask that question is to answer it.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to the question? Professor Markowitz, also, if you want to respond, let us know.
Yes, let me put on the, these were good points. What I would say is that in terms of both classical liberalism and classical socialism, I don't use those terms at all. Classical liberalism in the 20th century meant Robert La Follette, or rather the new liberalism, the progressive and radical and ultimately social democratic liberalism of Robert La Follette, later Fiorello LaGuardia, and most of all Franklin Roosevelt and others did not fit at all this view of liberalism as it developed. Liberalism has changed over and over again. It took a radical, progressive, social democratic form. Then it went back to the form of basically ignoring that, abandoning that. As for socialism, revolutionary socialism, Marxism-Leninism brought with it a different view of the state. The idea was to create a revolutionary worker state, and organize that state, committing itself to a policy of global anti-imperialism, to mobilize anti-imperialist movements, movements for national liberation, movements against racism, and build socialism internationally. And that was very different. That was an advance. So both of these movements have gone forward. As for where we are today, the issue is not the state or no state. The issue is not a return to anarchist conceptions of we're going to get rid of the state and have self-determining cooperatives, because that's not possible. The issue is to begin to educate people, reach out and educate people about the necessity of establishing a state that advances the policies that are in the interests of the working class, and at the same time, a state that will, because it is a worker state, establish socialism, because it will have to. How it will do that, we can't really say in terms of the specifics, because history never works that way. But it's something we should stand for, particularly today, because there really are no other alternatives. Okay.
I was directly addressed in the question, and I think the question for me was like holding on to some remnant of that, like a sort of like looking backwards into the past. You know, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into these things, and as I said, you know, the political landscape of the world right now isn't one that I would necessarily choose. You know, like I don't want to have the politics of the United States or like the collective West broadly center around Israel. Like I'm not sure that that's a particularly important thing, but I understand why it's happening. You know, Israel represents, for a kind of post-war order, the making right of crimes, historical crimes of the Second World War. And so we're all cursed, all of us here, as we sit in this room, cursed for the next 2 to 4 to 6 to maybe 20 years to have all politics revolve around this question of Israel and Zionism, right? We don't choose these things. These are the politics that are given to us. And I think that, like, if we have any purpose in life, us broadly, it's to try to unpack these things and to try to see some sort of movement to history, or at least to political thought. And I think that it's very important to recognize right now that what you're seeing is a global 1848, but against something that has been billed as socialism, which is this reactionary, administrative, welfarist state that arose not just in the United States, but in Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, that now broadly the working classes in alliance with the middle classes are now fighting against. And so we can sit back from that, we can watch that take place, we can call all the participants in that fascists, and we can say, well, we're going to try to recreate a New Deal, a Green New Deal or whatever. We can look towards the past for that. Or we could accept that the terms, political terms right now within the capitalist world are being set. And if we don't invest ourselves in them, if we don't engage with them, if we don't try to create some sort of counter program to them, counterpoint to them, that we're going to end up being subsumed, we're going to be overcome, we're going to be completely left in the dark. And I refuse to accept that we on the left should do that. I think that the legacy of 1776 is very much still alive, not just in the American and the Western working class, but in politics today. And the left ignores it at its peril. We really do.
Okay, next question. Yeah, Chris? Yep.
All right, I guess I wanted to bring it back to capitalism. So a couple of things that occurred to me in the discussion after the initial presentations, when thinking about the two foundings of the United States, like the 1776 founding, broadly speaking, and the Civil War founding, but also the Constitution and the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments as a second founding. And what occurred to me was not that many years ago, there was this idea of the 13th, right, 13th Amendment, and the fact that it includes conscript labor as like the fatal flaw in Reconstruction, that it was traceable to that it was a little bit of an escape hatch. And there was a book that I think an acquaintance of Adolf Reed, who's a mentor of mine, wrote Worse Than Slavery, about conscript labor after the Civil War. David Oshinsky, I think, or I hope I'm not mangling his last name. But anyway, a kind of leftist critique of the regime. But then if you go kind of after the fact, then it looks like, oh, that was intentional, right, to reinscribe slavery, but in this cunning way by having this little clause in the 13th Amendment. Whereas in fact, it was capitalism that did that. So I think that the attempt to sort of poison pill the American Revolution or the Civil War and Reconstruction, as if they didn't really mean it, or it sort of had this other intention that was papered over by ideology. I think that we do a disservice to the question of capitalism as something that couldn't really be anticipated by the authors of either the original Constitution or of the refounding of the Constitution through the Reconstruction Amendments. So otherwise we're in this progressive view of history, where you kind of have good guys and bad guys, people promoting progress versus people retarding progress, and then people like Lincoln and Jefferson become completely ambiguous as to what the intentions actually were. So I wanted to sort of throw that out there to see if any of you had anything to say about this assumption of a progressive narrative, which doesn't really do justice to actual history or the way history might still speak to us today.
I never found the argument about the 13th Amendment plausible. The wording that is referred to comes directly out of the Northwest Ordinance, which became the sort of like the gospel for all anti-slavery people, right? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. It had no relationship to the slavery by another name, as it was called. So I think it's just a gross misreading of what's going on in the 13th Amendment. I also think that there is a transformation going on right now in the way historians are talking about the U.S. Constitution's relationship to slavery. Right? For many, many years, William Lloyd Garrison's interpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document dominated the field, and it's become increasingly clear that the more he insisted on the pro-slavery nature of the Constitution, the more irrelevant he made himself to the larger anti-slavery movement, which took a very different position on the Constitution. And ultimately, we have two books about to come out on Frederick Douglass's interpretation of the Constitution, which is the radical alternative, completely opposite. It's an abolitionist document, right? And I think the more it becomes clear that Garrison's interpretation was John C. Calhoun's interpretation, not the way anti-slavery people, not the way most abolitionists thought about it. It's, then the way we go back and think about the original Constitution changes. And finding a conflict in the Constitutional Convention over slavery strikes me as a staggering, that it would never have happened 20 years earlier because of the transformation that James talked about, that the educational nature, the transformational nature of the revolution itself creates a situation which by 1787 there's an actual anti-slavery people in the Constitutional Convention that are pushing back against the pro-slavery people. And the result is a constitution that has pro-slavery elements in it and anti-slavery elements in it. It's a reflection of the conflict that was there. And I think it's really important to get away from, the anachronistic readings of the Constitution and all the stuff about, what it failed to do, rather than just figuring out what it did and how it did it. How slavery gets abolished, rather than the failure to abolish it all at once. And so.
Building on that, the American Revolution politicizes slavery, right? Politicizes slavery. It makes it a question. It writes a question mark next to it in a way it hadn't been before. And to kind of build on what Chris implied in his question, the progressive interpretation is getting progressively worse. That is to say, it used to be there was at least some radical revolution from below in 1776. That's what Carl Becker thought, Charles Beard, any number of 20th century progressives. And then there was a counter-revolution, a Thermidor, in the Federal Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and the ratification of the Constitution. I don't agree with that view, but it's at least a better view than the dominant progressive view today, which is that there was never any revolution whatsoever. It was all a counter-revolution to preserve slavery from the beginning. But to just go back to Chris's point about not thinking about this as good guys versus bad guys, the American Revolution in 1776 definitely unleashed a great deal of forces, and that's a very stupid thing to say, but I'll just put it that way. But the point is, the initial state constitutions were very majoritarian democratic. Why? Because they had been defending their colonial assemblies against the British Empire. The way the British imperial system developed, royal governors went out hand in hand without any fiscal or military resources of their own. So if they wanted to raise taxes, money, or they wanted to raise manpower, an army from the population in the colonies, they had to go to their elected representatives in the lower houses of the colonial assembly and ask for revenue and ask for manpower. And then those elected representatives and the constituents they represented demanded to know what they were going to use them for. And a process opened up where the British Empire served the needs of colonial society. And because these imperial forms that Norman talked about quite well, that George Grenville and the other kind of new Tories were seeking to break the link between taxation and representation. So they effectively decide to circumvent the colonial assemblies and allow a parliament with not a single colonial American representative in London, filled with landed gentlemen in the House of Commons and entitled aristocrats in the House of Lords. They get to raise revenue, confiscate the property of free laborers without a single elected representative or a single colonial American assembly approving of it, and then use it for whatever purposes they want. They're basically breaking the link between government and governed in the colonies. So initially, the American Revolution, in its desire to defend colonial assemblies, creates these extremely majoritarian democratic state constitutions. But then in 18th century terms, they're majoritarian democratic, right? 50 to 60% of adult males own enough property to be able to essentially participate in political life fully. They begin riding roughshod over the rights of minorities. And contra Matt McManus, not capitalists who own big concentrations of property, they began running roughshod over the rights of ethnic minorities, religious minorities, property minorities. And I want to correct something from the earlier panel, the very bad reading of James Madison's Federalist number 10. He is not defending capitalism. He is saying in Federalist number 10, you have to read the other Federalist papers written by Madison and Hamilton and Jay. But in Federalist number 10, what he's saying is, we constituted a new form of arbitrary power. When we overthrew hereditary privilege and royal authority and all of that, we didn't realize that going for this extremely democratic majoritarianism, we were constituting a new form of arbitrary power, a new despotism. Tocqueville will eventually call it the tyranny of the majority, but he gets it from the Federalist Papers and from the American Revolutionary documents. And a majority can be as arbitrary and despotic a faction as any royal or aristocratic one can be. That the sovereignty of the people is not just the sovereignty of a majority of the people, it's the sovereignty of all the people. And while the people are collectively a society, they're also individuals and minorities. And this ties back to Aaron's presentation from earlier today. The radical American revolutionary concept of popular sovereignty is you don't just have to defend majority rights, you have to defend minority rights. Why? Because you don't want a revolution every third Sunday. You need all people to think that they should be in this ship of society together. And therefore, they all have certain fundamental rights that not even majorities can ride roughshod over. Because even though they might lose an election or a policy debate here or there, they want to stay in this ship of society because they know that their most fundamental rights, their extraordinary rights embodied in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, are protected. And that's what Madison and the Federalist Papers are trying to lay out, that this new federal constitution essentially defends society and the liberty of all of its members, not just against arbitrary, aristocratic, monarchical despotism, but also majoritarian despotism. That's really important. And it just goes back to the point, you can't think of this as good guys versus bad guys. It's only in the unfolding of the revolution itself and its consequences that people begin to see exactly, they begin to think about what are the actual requirements of a free society. What are the actual, there isn't some ready-made royal road to a society that governs and regulates itself. They're figuring it out. We're still figuring it out, right? But the journey begins there, and we can't blame the beginning of the journey for where we, that is all of us here and in the world at the moment, ended up taking the ship that they launched. It's not their fault. It's ours that we are where we're at, right? And I'm sorry, Norman, with all due respect, we can just keep going back into American history and find the bogeyman, the original sin, the thing that is, the thing written in the stars and not in us. And I think that's just deflecting the fact that it's not their failure, it's our failure. Right? If we're so unhappy, if we're so alienated, if we don't have agency, if we're subject to heteronomous forces beyond our control, that's not the past's fault, that's our fault, right? And it's not that we can go find some, it's because of the Senate, or what was the other thing on the other, now it's the Supreme Court, right? Because there's not a progressive majority on the Supreme Court anymore, now we're being told the Supreme Court is the real problem. And if we just added 9 justices or 13 justices or whatever the Democrats come up with tomorrow, we'll fix it all. No, that's completely absurd. The problem is our society itself, and we have to confront the issue of capitalism. You can't, it's just an alibi for the problems and pathologies of capitalism to blame it on the Senate or the Electoral College or the Supreme Court. That path will lead us nowhere.
Professor Markowitz, do you want to respond to that?
These were points. Let me get my picture back. It's important for us to understand, in response to the original question, that the gains represented by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were largely not formally repealed, but basically undermined tremendously by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, over and over and over again, in the hands of conservative forces, reactionary forces, has reversed policy. And that's what it's, in recent years, the Supreme Court has repealed affirmative action. It has supported electoral policies that will greatly undermine free and open elections. As for the specific question about the end of Reconstruction, the capitalist class, which had, as a class, supported strongly the liquidation of the slaveholders who had prevented their development, undermined their development by the mid-1870s, were willing to accept home rule, as they called it, the restoration of the power of the former slaveholders, while making the South itself a kind of internal colony of Northern industrial capitalism. And their abandonment of the policies, the revolutionary policies that abolitionists had come forward with and had failed to carry forward the revolutionary land reform that many of them advocated, then became the basis of what subsequently happened. The court, over and over again, the court in the Dred Scott decision, the court in its 1880 decisions, and the court in recent years. So the court is important because the court remains the interpreter of the Constitution. Okay.
Should I speak? All right, I can speak. I can say something. Yeah, I do want to. I guess I want to because I'm on the panel. We had a mayoral election last year. It was kind of the context for the piece that I wrote, because I was thinking a lot about what that election meant, what democratic socialism meant, what socialism in one city might mean, you know, if we got Zoran to win. And it turns out he won. And one drum that I was banging on in the course of that primary and then election, because my trade union, which is to say actually existing working class organization, endorsed Andrew Cuomo. So I was fortunate enough to go to a great Cuomo rally, you know, which was like perfect for an Adam Curtis documentary, but really educational for me to go to. And the mayoral election here brought up a lot because primarily the left put so much importance in the Zoran candidacy. And here we are, what are we, 6 months into Zoran? And now we've won the fucking basketball title, you know, go Knicks or whatever. But like when that was happening, it was possible to see like a tension at work, right? You had a young jihadist Muslim who was trying to bring Sharia law to New York City and then presumably to America. And then you had Andrew Cuomo, who represents like the Cuomo dynasty, who was a status quo. Sure, yeah, we call him a corporatist. I call him a fascist, whatever. You know, he's a guy. And my union made me go to his rally. But then you had Curtis. Curtis. What is Curtis? He was a vigilante, you know. This guy, he was like a Batman. Before Batman, he would ply the subways finding, like Bernie Getz, he would just try to find people to assault as a young man, as we all did, you know, back then. But what was interesting about Curtis is that some footage floated around. It was from him at like in the 1980s on Maury Povich or one of these type shows. Where you still smoke cigarettes, you know, you like talk about the current events. And Curtis says he's got some rabbis up on stage, right? And I'm not gonna get anti-Semitic, because I don't do that, that's not my thing. But he's got some rabbis on stage like, listen, rabbis, like you want me to hate Palestinians. But in my group, in my organization called the Guardian Angels, I got an Arab, I got a Palestinian here, and I got a Jew on the other hand, and you know, he's a Zionist or whatever, and I tell him, squash your beef, because you're in the Guardian Angels. When the two of you get into this organization that we've created, you're not a Jew, you're not a Muslim, you're not an Arab, you're not a Hebrew or whatever, you're like a Guardian Angel. You know, and that was like an older idea, an older conception of what politics might be, which is like free association of people, like you quash your differences not through the state, not through lawsuits, not through policy or not through legislation, but instead as like part and parcel of being in an organization together. Right, and it's not to say I voted for Curtis, because I didn't vote for the guy. Of course I voted for Zoran, right? But it only like had a tantalizing sort of vision of what big R and small r Republican politics might be, which is like recognizing that the state, whether it's the municipal government here in New York City, as much as we love it, or the state of New York, or even the federal government, right, is this sort of estranged entity that exists above and beyond civil society that the left so often, really, it's like the horizon of our politics. And so without having voted for Curtis physically, maybe in my heart I voted for this idea that like you got a Palestinian, you got like an Israeli, and maybe you guys could overcome it if you join like a vigilante squad to like beat up young kids on the subway or whatever. All right, that's what I have to say.
Okay. Okay.
I wonder if we might be near the limit of the nation-state system, and if it might be useful to consider, similar to how the 1776 was using political power of the society, that there's a society of the world that could have political significance. And also maybe any comment about the New York City Charter Review.
Excuse me, I can't hear you. I didn't hear you. Sorry. I wanted to.
Could there be a pattern for 1776 represented revolted against the tyranny, that there is a kind of a tyranny globally or internationally that it could be solved with something analogous to a constitution for the world, and also any comment about the New York City Charter.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to take that, Norman?
Well, yeah, let me get my picture on. Yeah, I think that's, we have got to really go back to the United Nations Charter and what the United Nations has represented, what it has struggled to represent, and bring back the United Nations so that it can become, in effect, the basis for international civil rights, international civil liberties, and in the tradition of UNRWA, the post-war United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, which played an important role, the basis for economic development internationally, which will create an economic foundation for this. So in terms of the best of the American Revolution, its continuation, and this was the United Nations that Franklin Roosevelt called for its creation, that we should, that's the answer, that's the only possible answer right now to that question, which is that I can think of, which is a very good question, a very good question.
For one more question, is that good? Aaron?
Thanks, everybody. Shaun, at one point you had said that you're the only non-historian here, and I just wanted to say, like, on behalf of those of us who organized this, there's actually a reason that we invited you guys, right? We think it is important to have a discussion with the historians and with people on the left, right, about the meaning of the American Revolution for the left. And so we were kind of hoping that these things would speak to each other. And I think in a way, actually, they did. And I wanted to maybe bring that out and ask a question about that. I know we're running up on time. But I did notice that there seemed to be kind of different ideas about change, like how change happens in American history, and also what the problem is for socialism today, right? So Shaun, you said there was a counter-revolution, like around Wilson, right, that created this state. And you felt as though, you kind of needed the Constitution, right? Or at least the Bill of Rights, these sorts of things, in order to do the organizing that you want to do, right? That the imagination you have for how to organize socialism, in fact, requires the civil liberties in the Constitution. And I felt that this was sort of the exact opposite of what Professor Markowitz was saying, that it seems like the Constitution is somehow a block or an obstacle that's in the way of some sort of change, right? And maybe that's something like racial equality or something else. And I thought this related actually to Professor Oakes's very first presentation about how it was, right, that the Constitution and, its radicalization after 1800 and the inheritance of the American Revolution kind of conditioned a political struggle over the question of slavery. And so I thought it would be nice if the panelists could speak to, well, maybe just one more thing before I kind of ask the question, sorry. But Norman, I found myself wondering if you or maybe your comrades would have felt the same way back during the civil rights movement. As in, it seems like there's been a sort of disappointment with the result of, the end of Jim Crow civil rights and the end of juridical racial segregation since the 60s. You talked about like a counter-revolution since LBJ. And, it made me think of like Black Lives Matter, this sort of thing, right? And a lot of the books that were about like the 13th Amendment, like these new Jim Crow books that were very current when I first went to school, had this sort of idea that actually like you thought that within the system of the Constitution and amending it and the democratic process, you could overcome something like racism. But then people felt like it didn't really turn out the way they imagined it would. And, it made me wonder, like, what do you think, like, in the struggle for socialism, if we're thinking about organizing for socialism or communism or something like that, is the Constitution really in the way of that, right? Like, is the Constitution the main obstacle to something like the dictatorship of the proletariat or a socialist movement or an organization of the working class? Like, is that really the reason that these things haven't worked out? And how do we imagine, like, how is it that in America, somebody would have to struggle for socialism? Like, what does the fact that we live in this nation and really a world that's conditioned by the American Revolution mean about, how one would struggle for socialism? So I wanted to pose that question because I thought maybe it would get Shaun in conversation with the history a little bit. And also because Professor Markowitz, I was interested in us reflecting on why we think the way we do about these things now, and especially given your own historical experience. Sorry, that was long.
I'd like to thank you. Those are interesting points. I'd like to make a few quick responses. One, the position of my party, the CPUSA, has been for more than half a century Bill of Rights socialism. And that's a concept, a useful concept that we can carry forward and advance. Bill of Rights socialism. As for the Constitution, it has changed. It has grown. It has moved in positive and negative directions. It is a living document. It can be used and has been used effectively to advance the interests of the working class and the whole people. And it's been used in a very negative and destructive way. That is the way we should look at it. As for the civil rights movement, it's important to remember that, again, active communists, members of our party, in spite of the relentless persecution that our party faced in the post-World War II era, because of our achievements in the 30s and the 40s, we continued to play a role in grassroots struggle. And if you don't believe me, believe J. Edgar Hoover, who launched a relentless campaign against Martin Luther King and a great many others, important figures, because of the role, well, the real and imagined, of Marxist, Leninist, communist activists. Yeah, that's pretty much what I would say. The left is for socialism or it's nothing. Nothing. And you don't have to support the CPUSA, you don't have to support the DSA, you don't have to support this party or that party, but you've got to move in the direction of building the kind of broad united front, people's front, that can advance the struggle for socialism, because right now, the choices are, which shall it be? Socialism or fascism? Not immediately, but certainly in the medium run. Okay, those are my views, and thank you for those questions. And even with all my problems hearing the discussion, hearing the panel, it's been a very good panel, and I'm glad I participated.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to respond to Aaron's questions?
Just a couple of points following up on, maybe finishing a point I didn't finish earlier, about if we're going to talk about the legacy of the American Revolution, how useful it is. I think it's important to understand that when the authors of the 13th Amendment took their language directly from the Northwest Ordinance, they were tying what they were doing directly back to the American Revolution. Right? And that is one of the best examples I can find in American history where the revolution is brought to bear on a profound question of social equality and the like. Relatively minor point. I'm not going to defend what the Supreme Court did in the United States after the Civil War, but I think what happened in the South has a lot more to do with the emergence of a landlord-merchant class that ultimately overthrows, through systematic disfranchisement, the legacy of Reconstruction. If the Supreme Court could have issued all those decisions, but without that landlord-merchant class, getting rid of the people who were the most threat to them systematically between 1890 and 1920, I don't think the court's decisions would have made much difference.
Oh yeah, Aaron, thank you for inviting me as a non-historian here. I like to think that our ideas are animated by history at the same time, but not being a professional maybe opens you up to a little bit of leeway to be like, maybe not like George Sorel, like create myths, but like glom onto various different ideas that with too many footnotes might be a little bit too unwieldy for to be used politically, right? And with that said, like, do people out here in TV land, do people out here in the audience recognize, understand that we are seeing before our eyes as we speak like a new form of very dark tyranny, like techno-tyranny arising like before our eyes? Do we not see that? Because it's like a frog maybe in a pot boiling, but we are seeing in front of us right now this amalgamation of state and corporate power, which I think is very, very frightening. And it's not just me, it's like working class people, middle class people, people all over the political spectrum are feeling this, right? And if we don't break ourselves from the administrative state, from this apparatus of tyranny that's arising right now, if we don't break ourselves from tech, from all that stuff, then our politics will remain indistinguishable from that of what I would argue is a rising fascism. I haven't been a person that's been banging the drum about fascism up until maybe the last year or so, right? But what we're seeing right now is very, very dark. And how we understand the resistance to that has to be supple and has to be in tune with, I think, what the broad common sense popular wisdom of people is nowadays, and that is that there is a global elite right now. We would call it the capitalist ruling class, right? Other people would call it the Davos elite. Maybe they would call it like Soros. Maybe they would be anti-Semitic about it, right? But like these are all things that we can recognize as tendencies of capital towards consolidation and concentration. And I just think we do ourselves a great disservice when we don't realize that right populism, left populism, whatever it is, especially right populism, libertarianism or whatever, is a nod towards this conception of freedom, which is much older than ourselves and one that is not separated from or separable from the struggle for socialism. In fact, socialism with American characteristics will necessarily be that which calls upon these things into being. And maybe it's because I'm not a historian that I can say that. I don't know. I would actually ask that James and Professor Oakes and Professor Markowitz as well maybe talk about what the
Markowitz, not Moskowitz.
I'm so sorry, Professor. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Maybe they could talk about what the political implications are of what they believe, because maybe that's what I'm here for, and maybe that's what I'd like to hear from them as the professionals here. What the political implications today are of the way that they understand the history of the American Revolution.
Well, I think that's things. Okay. It's very late, but something is interesting in terms of this discussion. Nobody has said a word, myself included, and I should have, about the People's Republic of China, which is on its way to becoming the major world economy and still under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and which has been developing. I visited Wuhan and participated in a large conference from the School of Marxism in 2019 and got to meet many people and was quite impressed, all things considered, about what had been accomplished and what the society was struggling to accomplish, namely a new model of socialism based on a mixed economy with the state and the party playing the leading role in controlling finance, permitting both an internal capitalist class, which depends for its survival on it, and also foreign investment, and that this system has real possibilities for many countries, including our own. Furthermore, China today is increasingly the major target of the neo-Cold Warriors who, under the leadership of Donald Trump, basically represent a neo-fascist axis, seeking to develop that neo-fascist axis with countries like Italy, Japan, as its allies, and seeking to advance its position in South America, especially. And of course, Israel too, as its ally. In the Middle East, as its primary ally. Okay.
Thank you.
Aaron, to answer your question tangentially, indirectly, I know that it can sound like things that Shaun has said and Jim has said and I have said, indeed you yourself have said, can sound like alibying the President of the United States or the constitutional order of the President of the United States because it seems so defensive of it. But of course, there are many possible criticisms and transformations of the US constitutional order that will be necessary. But I think we had to think of the conditions of possibility under which that takes place, right? It might be the case that in a mass-based workers' movement for socialism, eventually it's found the need to have new constitutional convention or conventions and to discuss and debate transformations of the constitutional order in that context. All I will say is the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, the Republican Party, Debs's Socialist Party, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Emancipation Movement, none of those movements found it impossible or difficult to organize for social and political change within the existing constitutional order. Now, a renewed workers' movement for socialism may find in the course of its development that indeed there has to be a constitutional convention and there has to be some kind of confrontation with the existing constitutional order. But I think that those are the conditions in which such a convention should be held. You know, earlier today, people were bringing up, I can't remember which they were referring to, but there are all these proposals for new constitutional convention by progressives, people like Sandy Levison at the University of Texas Law School and others. I mean, there'd be a nightmarish world of like academics like myself and lawyers and NGO policy wonks sitting in that convention and saying, oh, freedom of associate, as long as you have 9 negative COVID tests, then you can go associate or whatever. You know, you just know it'd be an endless, not rights, but rather the limitations of rights. So I would just insist, I know I could sound like I'm alibiing the constitutional status quo. I'm not. I'm trying to say that there's nothing that prevents the left from organizing for social transformation under the present conditions of the US constitutional order. And perhaps there will have to be a confrontation and transformation of that order, but we can only know about that in the process of trying to transform the capitalist order. I think to try and have a constitutional convention now, simply a progressive nightmare would come out on the other end of it.
Yeah, we've seen the results of that. Chile recently had a constitutional convention under, what was that Democratic Socialist name? Boric? Yes, thank you. And it was exactly as you describe it. It's a series of NGOs and like groups who decided things, right? One of the pushbacks that I got when I wrote this last year, and only like 4,000 people read it, so it's not like super important, but one of the pushbacks I got was like this idea that jettisoning this administrative state or like understanding that as co-equal with socialism means that you don't care about the things that like progressives have fought for and won over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years or whatever, right? But like, do we need any more evidence that things like fights for racial equality and against gender oppression, things like meritocratic visions, universalistic and humanistic visions of human freedom have no worse repository than like a party, the Democratic Party, which is like a middle-class activist sort of bringing together of various non-governmental organizations and pressure groups under the auspices of a party that fights for state action. Like these things, we can care about these principles. We can care deeply about them while thinking that the way that they're currently worked through right now in 21st century American capitalist politics is deeply broken. And so like we can posit instead again, and I want to build off of this sort of heady vision, of 1776, of this like bringing forth of human potential and human freedom and association. Like we can imagine these same principles, universalistic, liberal principles of equality being brought forth instead of as like a jobs program for college graduates or NGO denizens, instead as like a bottom-up working class initiative to solve our own problems. Those problems being our division by race, our division by gender, by sexual orientation, by nationality, and all these things. These are things that we need to take responsibility for. And I think that thinking about civil society and the Constitution in these terms, you know, of like free association and the free development and the free interplay of human creativity and association and interaction, is the way that we on the left can break from very, I think, sclerotic conceptions of what democratic socialism or progressive socialism might mean in the 21st century, when these things are already under attack from all sides. Should we be defending them, or should we be building our own thing? And I argue we should be building our own thing.
Okay, and with that, I would like to ask for a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.